And if you want to fix aviation, you have to start to price the ticket right. It may mean initially that the price is too much and people will revolt as a result. So there has to be a way in which you come to a place where you can start to jack up the price so that it actually reflects the technology. And maybe government subsidies do come in to try and make those technologies cheaper. All I'm saying is there are places where we have figured this out, and it can be done for sustainable aviation fuels, which is no longer a technology that yet needs to be invented. It exists, it has a price, that price will fall the more you make it, and we know how to do that, and we've done it for other technologies.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Akshat Rathi. Akshat is an award-winning senior reporter for Bloomberg News. He's also the author of a new book, Climate Capitalism, a book I have read and enjoyed very much myself. The book starts with the first line that it is now cheaper to save the world than to destroy it. It's a very interesting premise that I wanted to dig in with an aviation angle because capitalism is about growth. But if we grow aviation relentlessly, then it increases emissions. So how do we balance it? Akshat and I speak about a lot of other industries that have successfully decarbonized or begun their path to decarbonization and how some of those lessons can be applied to aviation as well. Akshat has a fantastic pedigree. He has a PhD in organic chemistry from Oxford and is the host of Zero, a climate podcast for Bloomberg Green.
Luigi Zingales, an economist at the University of Chicago, says, let's take Milton Friedman at his word that maximizing profits for the shareholder should be the priority. If the social goal is to support education, then it doesn't matter whether a shareholder donates $1 to the local university or the corporation does. If the goal is to reduce pollution, however, the cost of stopping the pollution before it happens at the corporation is much lower than the cost of the shareholder cleaning up afterwards. In living up to Friedman's doctrine of maximizing profits, businesses have cut costs and investment, even if that means employing people in precarious jobs, not paying them living wages, polluting the environment, avoiding taxes, and influencing regulations to ensure none of those social ills violate any laws. That clearly is not a sustainable model for people or the planet. And that's why you're seeing businesses starting to leave the doctrine behind.
Thank you, Akshat. Now, that, I think, is towards the latter half of your book, but that is the premise of your book, that it is now cheaper to save the world than to destroy it. That's how you start the book. What led you to this conclusion?
Well, it's not, so to speak, my conclusion. It is the conclusion that economists over decades of work have come to. Most famously, Lord Nicholas Stern here in the UK published a report called the Stern Review, which looked at the costs of climate impacts and compared it to the cost of climate action. And the difference is huge. It will cost more if we let climate change rampant than it will to pay for the solutions to reduce emissions. And this is all in the context of assuming that there will be economic growth over the next decade and centuries to come. And I think people need to appreciate what luxury it is to fly. You know, I hear people at airports complaining, oh, my flight's late today, oh, 2 hours late, oh, I didn't fly business, can't afford it, but like I had to sit on a seat for 9 hours and my back is aching a little bit. And I'm like, you just flew a continent. You're in a different country. You can afford to fly. That is a miracle. We should appreciate miracles. Like, I am annoyed if I don't get a window seat because I love watching the fact that I am taking off in a tin can above the clouds and I'm going to a new place. That to me is an exciting thing. And I'm always amazed when I fly. And I think that amazement is being lost today. People don't appreciate what they have. And that appreciation is not there because they're not paying the right price.
Yep, I truly believe in the magic of flying personally. And like you, I'm always on the window seat. And a lot of my business traveler friends, give me a look on that. But yes, I like to look outside and I'm still taking time-lapse videos of the clouds flying past. When we talk about economic growth and we relate it to aviation, since this is an aviation podcast and decarbonizing aviation, growth within aviation is linked to economic growth as well as growth in profitability and everything that the industry stands for. I mean, it connects remote communities. It is an essential service in many parts of the world. Very few of the world population has actually flown internationally, especially in the global south. So it is a great leveler. And yet, it is a very hard to decarbonize industry. Do you agree with that statement or do you not?
Well, hard to decarbonize is a phrase that's been around and it's been applied to a number of industries. And I think the words that we use around climate solutions need to change as the set of solutions change. It's no longer an excuse to use that it's a hard to decarbonize industry. That would have been fair to say when there were no technologies available at scale to decarbonize that technology. That's not the case with aviation today. There is sustainable aviation fuels, and that can work at scale. The problem is the cost, not the technology anymore. So I think there are a number of areas that used to be called hard to decarbonize that just need to not call that need not be called hard to decarbonize anymore. And aviation squarely sits in that place now.
This is interesting because at least the aviation executives, the airline executives I speak with, would love to believe that it is a hard to decarbonize industry.
Well, they will be pushing for people to think it's a hard to decarbonize sector and thus slow the action in actually decarbonizing because they can use that excuse to try and slow down the pace of decarbonization or not pay the price needed to use the solutions that do exist. And so, I'm not sure I'm here to convince airline executives whether it is a hard to decarbonize sector or not. What I'm trying to say is the solutions do exist. They cost a bit of money, probably a lot of money, but that is your job to figure out how to make sure that those solutions actually scale because the targets are pretty clear.
Are there examples that you can share from some of the fantastic case studies you've had in your book of formerly hard to decarbonize industry, which had very high costs of decarbonization that have overcome this hurdle?
It's happened in every sector that has started to decarbonize, right? Solar power was very, very expensive. There were estimates that without solar panel prices falling to a certain level, there is no way this thing becomes a reality. But between the creation of a technology and its eventual price for commercialization, there is a big gap, and that gap needs to be filled. And there are clear examples and steps that can be taken to do that. And they can be a mix of steps. Like, it doesn't have to be the same formula applied to every technology. In the case of solar, it started off as an experiment. Then the US government was interested in it and bought really, $1 million small, tiny solar panels to be put on satellites because that's how you could power satellites. And that was a good use of money. And then eventually a government came up with the idea that we should actually start to put solar panels on the roof because we know the more that we do that, the cheaper it will become. But we are Germany and we can afford expensive solutions because eventually that will help not just us, but the world. And so we're going to put $1 trillion. That's how much money was put forth in the Energiewende, which is the policy that Germany applied to all its energy transition, but a lot of it went towards solar deployment on rooftops.
When was this?
This was in the early 2000s.
So not too long ago, 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, early 2000s. And that's when the Chinese realized, oh, there's a huge European market being created. Governments are committing vast sums of money. Let us create an industry that will supply the European market. And so they built that industry, and that industry was making solar panels cheaper than the Europeans or the Americans were doing. And thus, China became the supplier of solar panels to the world. And a bunch of German companies went bust, but Germany got solar for cheap eventually. And so you get technology and government policy and entrepreneurs and countries competing in this mix that is the formula to try and make a hard to decarbonize technology become a reality.
Let's build on this. And this is a great start. Applying it to aviation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there is sustainable aviation fuel available. There are challenges, and it's not just the cost. For example, the tailpipe emissions are still pretty much the same. It's still CO2 being emitted from the plane. It's the life cycle emissions that we are talking about reducing, and depends on what the feedstock is. We're looking at anywhere from 20% for LCAFs to up to 80% in certain cases. The challenge there is the cost and also the availability of feedstock. Currently, the airline's fuel bill for jet aviation fuel is anywhere from 25 to 35% based on where they're flying. If you're talking about the cheapest SAF in the world, which is in California, it is about 2x jet A fuel price. Now you're looking at 60% or potentially doubling of fares, at which point it's no longer feasible to fly an airline or operate an airline business unless it is with government subsidies.
Yeah. Well, there are things that we've been doing that we've not been paying the full price for. And that's been true historically for a lot of the fossil fuels that we've used. We've just never priced them right. We've never priced the pollution that comes from them. And so you get to a point where corporations and aviation, you and I, we've benefited from aviation. I live in this country because I was able to fly out from India, right? I never took a flight till I was 15 years old. But now I know my nephews and nieces who've flown when they were 2 years old. So it's certainly been a benefit to the world, but it's come at a cost that we never paid. And now we're being asked to pay that because we recognize the cost and society is bearing that cost, and that cost is only going to go up. So there has to be a way to find paying the real price for what is the most advanced form of transport, right? We kind of leapfrogged without paying the real price for it. Now we are recognizing there is a huge cost and we are not paying the right price. I mean, it's ridiculous to me that you can fly for £20 from London to Rome. That should not be.
It's cheaper than the Uber ride to Heathrow.
Exactly. It should not be possible. And yet it is possible. And that is wrong. And if you want to fix aviation, you have to start to price the ticket right. It may mean initially that the price is too much and people will revolt as a result. So there has to be a way in which you come to a place where you can start to jack up the price so that it actually reflects the technology. And maybe government subsidies do come in to try and make those technologies cheaper. All I'm saying is there are places where we have figured this out and it can be done for sustainable aviation fuels, which is no longer a technology that yet needs to be invented. It exists, it has a price, that price will fall the more you make it, and we know how to do that, and we've done it for other technologies.
Fantastic, thank you. A few more things to dig in to that, right? You talked about the £20 fare to Rome. The airlines that often offer that are called low-cost airlines or low-fare LCCs in our world. That's where a lot of the growth has been coming from. And there are two things that stand out about these. Let's say Wizz Air, for example, big in London, big in Europe. They are one of the fastest growing airlines in Europe. They also have the youngest fleet, which means they can claim to be the greenest airline in Europe on a per seat mile flown basis.
Yeah, but the relative greenness of your most efficient plane versus not flying is huge. And so, that's a claim that is, in numbers correct relative to older planes, but not relative to not flying, right? And it's greener, not green, right? So, the low cost airlines make those claims, but those are claims that need to be judged on the relative nature of them, not the absolute nature. Because the absolute nature is still true that you are flying to Rome at 20 pounds, and your Rome flight, I think, would be about 300 kilograms of emissions, even in the cleanest airline, right? So that is a lot of emissions. That's 0.3 tons being emitted for 20 pounds, right? That's $60 or 60 pounds a ton, which is not even the carbon price that the European Union is paying for, say, power right now. And how can you allow aviation to get away with just that on its own?
Okay.
For the carbon price, not even the cost of the plane, not even the cost of the services being provided to you on the plane.
Just the fuel price.
Exactly.
Just the fuel price. Fair point.
And there is no carbon price on these fuels. There is not even a tax on aviation fuel. Like, that should make people realize how cheap these things are because they are not being priced right.
So it seems that government needs to come in. But if you look at other corporates, what we are essentially debating is the capitalist view of a corporation. So let's look at Microsoft, for example. You recently had interviewed their president, I believe. And Microsoft, by this time, should have reduced its emissions by 30%, but they have grown by 30%, not because it's not doing anything in terms of sustainability. I think it's one of the big leaders when it comes to decarbonization, but because they've invested a lot in AI and ChatGPT and all the stuff that they're doing, which generates more emissions, building these data centers you talked about. Now we see a corporate that is committed to sustainability, yet its growth has pushed emissions in the wrong direction. Going back to Wizz Air and applying this same thing, while yes, they do have the lowest per seat mile emissions, their total absolute emissions are actually up 34% since 2019 because they have grown. How do traditional capitalist corporations like Microsoft or Wizz Air work this out?
Yeah, this is the central problem of climate capitalism. It's that capitalism has only been counting the revenues generated from sales and not paying the right price for the emissions that those sales generate. When you start to price those emissions right, then you actually price the profits right. And then you actually make decisions that are more sensible than the decisions that are currently being made by lots and lots of industries. It's not just true of aviation, it's also true of AI, right? So we asked Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, those questions. We are like, okay, you have a plan. You are very clear you're not giving up on that plan. That plan is to be carbon negative by 2030, which means your emissions should have been 30% lower last year, but they are 30% higher. So how are you going to square the circle? Would it mean that you will stop pushing on AI because it is the AI push that is causing your emissions to grow? And in the case of Microsoft, they can legitimately say, no, we won't, because we think it's a growth industry. And we do think, and I don't know about the legitimacy of whether this claim, which is that AI will be beneficial to humanity, is valid. And I don't know how even to measure that right now. But they can say that and then say, if by 2030 we don't meet our goals, we will buy carbon removal to meet it. And those goals would be legitimately met with a very expensive carbon removal technology that actually counts for all the tons that Microsoft emitted. But that's because Microsoft's emissions are 16 million tons. Wizz Air's emissions are 34 million tons already, right? Wizz Air, which most people in the world haven't heard of because it's a European airline. But Microsoft is a company that lots and lots of people have heard, probably 2-3 billion people have heard, is able to do that because its own emissions are actually, on an absolute level, quite small. Whereas the emissions of fossil fuel dependent industries are just going to be a lot higher. And so it's a different challenge that Wizz Air faces versus what Microsoft faces. So I don't know if you can compare the two. Microsoft, if it doesn't reach the 2030 goal, we will be asking them questions, but they have said we will buy carbon removal if it comes to that. Wizz Air cannot afford to buy that much carbon removal if it did have a goal like Microsoft does, which it doesn't.
Airlines cannot. And let's go to a legacy airline, right? So Air France KLM, for example. So Air France has 99 Airbus A350s on order, and these will continue to get delivered through 2027, and they will continue to fly past 2050. That's how they are amortized. And that means they will continue using traditional fuels, sustainable or not, way past 2050. And no airline is saying, oh, I will buy carbon removals to make sure I'm zero, to square the circle, like you said, because airlines don't make that much money as Microsoft does. I think Brad is betting on Microsoft's share price being high enough in 2030 to be able to pay for these carbon removals at a more expensive price.
Yeah, well, NVIDIA just beat Microsoft to become the most valuable company. $3 trillion valuation for a company is kind of ridiculous at this point. But the point for airlines is to recognize that what they are providing is mostly a luxury good. And I think there is no accounting of what are survival emissions and what are luxury emissions. We treat each ton as its own, but flying, for the most part, is a luxury good. And it should be priced at a luxury price point. It isn't. So, you could start, again, if you want to go down policy routes, again, I'm not a policy think tank, but you could start to price frequent flyers a lot more than you're pricing the first time flyer or the once a year flyer. And that is a perfectly reasonable policy that'll have support from the vast majority of the population, because you cannot have policies that are not popular because they will not work. And so you have to find a way in which you pay the right price for flying.
So let's talk a little about that, right? It is indeed true. 1% of frequent flyers are responsible for 50% of global aviation's emissions. And that is a fact. So yes, it makes sense. Go tax these guys and they'll pay more. You had Catherine McKenna on your podcast who implemented carbon taxation in Canada. She was my MP, my local MP in Canada. And the way she did it was, firstly, to not call it a levy, not call it a tax, it's carbon pricing. And she made sure that a lot of money goes into the pockets of a lot more Canadians than who are charged for driving big trucks, for example, right? How do we implement a frequent flyer tax that is accepted by the industry, not necessarily imposed on it through a government? Because then I think it's very hard to implement it.
I mean, the difficulty with any climate policy is that a company trying to do something green voluntarily is usually making itself less competitive in the market because it is paying a higher price to do something that nobody else is doing. Which is why you want governments to come in to level the playing field. If you have an industry that must go green, then all players in that industry should go green. And that's why the case I make in climate capitalism is that industries now have to work with governments to figure out the right regulations. Governments will have their own ideas, and those ideas may then, if companies don't do that, then governments will be forced because they have targets that they must reach. Aviation is now becoming a part of these targets, which it wasn't in the past. And that means governments will eventually enforce those rules. And if companies don't like those rules at that point, they will have no choice. But right now, they do have a choice to work with governments to figure out the right rules. Most of the time, companies don't want any rules, because why would you want rules? You just want to make as much money as possible. But we do live in a society where You have to have rules, otherwise you can, slash and burn, and that corporation may make profits for some time, and then will have to be uh, will either go bankrupt, or people won't buy its services, or will not be seen
It won't
as
be
a
relevant.
socially acceptable actor. And so, if you want a corporation that has to make money in the long term, providing service that people want, it should do so in the rules that are being created for it, that would allow it to operate in an ethical way, in a sensible way, but also a socially acceptable way. And governments can do that. So, corporations should stop seeing governments as the evil that stops them from making more profits, but see them as an ally to figure out how to work in the 21st century, where climate change will be a defining problem.
So it seems like policymakers, governments, and corporates need to work together. We have two very different models, especially in aviation, where the EU has the Refuel EU mandate. It's a mandate. And in the US, there's the IRA, which is giving a lot of incentives. We've seen different effectiveness of this. What works better in an industry like aviation?
It's not, the nice thing about climate capitalism is that there isn't one cookie cutter formula that will work for everybody. It is really dependent on the unique mix of politics and policies and governance that exist in those regions. Why does the US go for a tax credit model? It's because there are two parties in the US, one that believes in climate change, one that doesn't, one that does take action, and finally, at scale, one that wants to dismantle all that action. And so the only common ground that they are able to find is to heavily subsidize industry to do green things rather than put a price on the pollution. Europe is a very different beast. It's a super body made of sovereign states. And that means the super body doesn't have as much power as the sovereign states do. And so it has to work through cajoling these states to do the right thing, even as it is responsible for setting climate targets. And that ends up being creating standards, creating regulations, creating mandates. And those are then fought over, there's horse trading, there's dilution, and yet the European Union is the best continent in making these rules, even if it's not always able to put all the subsidies that the US is able to towards those technologies. Those are just two different ways of doing climate policy, and it is complicated. But the nice thing is people are trying, governments are trying, large economies are trying, and we'll see what works. And hopefully these policies don't just stay in rich countries. That's where most of the aviation is, and that's where most of these policies should come first. But then they also need to go to developing countries, which are seeing the most growth when it comes to aviation.
Absolutely. We are seeing similar policies from Japan to the taxation in Singapore that was recently announced. So we are definitely seeing this spread out. You bring up different countries, and one of the core factors for sustainability in aviation is that around equity and global equity. Most of the flying is done by a very small number of people, not just in Western Europe and North America, but also in places like India, where 1% of the population is responsible for more than 50% of the flying, for example. Yet, I think the number I heard last was only 10% of Indians have ever been on a plane, and 1% of Indians have ever flown internationally. So growth in places like India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Turkey is going to come. At which point, demand management, which is one of the levers in the EU or other countries that a lot of governments or even airports and definitely climate activists are pushing for, that's no longer feasible. It's sort of a climate colonialism to tell other countries, hey, don't fly. How would that work if all of the growth from the developing world negates any effort that have been taken by developed world?
The difficulty with most climate conversations is that if you start to project what is going to be the demand for certain products in 30 years, 40 years, 70 years, based on what we know today, you're quickly going to say, this problem can never be solved. There is no way we're meeting net zero. Let's just give up and sit and burn more fossil fuels, I guess. So, yes, those are real numbers, which is that so few people have flown and they would want to fly, given we've seen in other places when you have the ability to pay for flying, people do fly. But we are going to live in a hotter and hotter world. Look at what's happening in India this past week. The heat wave in India is brutal, right? In Delhi, people are just dying of heat exhaustion. If you're talking 50 years from now and we haven't cut emissions, we are looking at 2 degrees Celsius of warming or more already baked in. That's double the amount of warming that we have today. Do you think there will be enough economic growth in those developing countries to actually have people be ability to pay for the flights, right? People will become more conscious, realizing that this pollution is what is causing the problem. They have already become more conscious. There are movements that are being created in Europe to stop flying, to take more trains. There are movements that are calling for frequent flyer tax. Those will grow in size. And so to assume growth in demand based on current projections and then assume how can we ever solve this problem is the wrong way of looking at the problem. The right way of looking at the problem is that we do have a set of solutions. We do have a bunch of climate policies that could work. We don't know which one would be perfect. We don't know how it will work in developing countries when eventually we have to get those policies there. But we can start to act now, and we can start to figure out these solutions. And we may not get the perfect answer, but at least we can make attempts. What I am seeing in these so-called hard to decarbonize sectors is there's not enough desire to make attempts because the hard to decarbonize is used as an excuse to not really try.
I think that's one, and that's a very good point. Thank you. I think that's one bit that I think aviation has done. There are ample experiments going on in multiple places, from the first SAF flights to SkyTeam running its own sustainable flight challenge where multiple airlines are competing to reduce emissions. And I think that is encouraging. The challenge is the scale up of this, or just equity. For example, Neste, the big SAF producer, they have 3 plants globally, Rotterdam, Singapore, and one in Finland, barely can make enough SAF to supply one airline, let alone so many. But they don't have plants on the drawing board in India, Turkey, Indonesia, Philippines.
Well, you can take solution examples as well. Take LanzaJet, right? LanzaJet is a company that was started by a climate startup called LanzaTech. They capture emissions from steel mills, typically carbon monoxide, which eventually will become carbon dioxide, and turn that into ethanol first using bacteria, using living organisms that consume carbon monoxide and make ethanol. And that is now being produced at scale. The first of a kind large scale plant that they're building in Georgia, in the US, is under construction and will soon be producing SAF at scale. So there are ways in which you can do it. Yes, to get there, they needed support from private industry, from governments. Breakthrough Energy came up with a program called Catalyst, where they got corporations to make advance market purchases from LanzaJet to commit to buying millions of tons, millions of tons of SAF way out in the future. That allowed them to go to the bank and say, we have these orders, we know how to make this product, we've been making it at scale, we will make it at bigger scale. Please give us the loans, low-cost debt to be able to build this plant. And we've done it. Again, it's very easy to talk about the problems and the challenges that exist there. I'm not saying they're not real, but there are also solutions on how to overcome them. And it requires people to keep trying.
LanzaJet is indeed a very good example, especially within aviation. Jimmy, their CEO, I've had him on the podcast, is ex-United Airlines. He's also an ex-White House intern. He knows policy himself. And the most interesting thing is that they are going to be licensing their technology to Australia now to build a plant in Townsville, Queensland, of all places, to make SAF there. So yes, it is scaling. It is one of those, silver linings in the clouds that are there. And I'm truly hopeful, fingers crossed, that it will scale.
Yeah, I mean, there are other examples where you may not even need fossil fuels, right? Electric aviation, which I've been skeptical of, and increasingly more and more people are convincing me that it may be possible. It's a very different kind of aviation. It's not going to be the cross-continental electric flight, but a few hundred kilometers, that can be a very real solution. In America, where most of the electric aviation startups are, there are regional airports that do exist, a vast array of them that are not usually used for commercial enterprise. They're used by private hobbyists, by private jets, but that could be turned into regional flight hubs. So you may want to take 3 flights to get to Atlanta rather than the 1 flight, but your overall emissions will be 0 because there are no greenhouse gas emissions being produced if it's powered by renewables, because there is no tailpipe emissions attached. And these flights are real. These planes are real. They can fly hundreds of kilometers today. And the batteries that power them are still way off from the capacity of what batteries could be within decades. And so you'll have to think of a new form of transport. It may not be as equivalent to what we have today. It'll be different. Maybe there'll be other services that will come up in these flight hubs. Maybe people would prefer not to fly as far distance because there'll be more holiday destinations being created close by. There are possibilities that are created with a different form of technology, but we have to start to think about those technologies because we do need decarbonized solutions.
Absolutely. And electric aviation in North America is indeed, that is a very important use case. Harbour Air, for example, in Canada, has a eBeaver electric aircraft that goes between Victoria and Vancouver. And they have recently announced an MOU with a company where they will help retrofit the other company's Beavers. Now, the interesting thing is, I was speaking to their CEO, there are more of these general aviation Beavers only in Canada than the number of total commercial aircraft in the world.
What?
Exactly.
No.
Yes. 65,000.
That's crazy. I didn't know that.
65,000 general aviation aircraft. And Canada is the second largest market. The US is the largest in the world.
Wow.
So if Harbour Air can just electrify these guys, that's already a lot of savings in fuels. And you can start today. You don't need EP Systems, H22. These guys are making batteries, Magni X, that are ready. And Harbour Air is flying them.
Right.
So you're right. We have to think laterally. It's not just this long haul flight from London to India or from New York to Singapore that you have to decarbonize. It's these little hops that matter as well. And people will mold their behaviors, rethink what they're doing if these options are available. Let me talk about how you and I are addressing our climate impact. So, Akshat, I know, like me, you were born in India. And you still go back to visit your folks in Nasik.
Yeah, once a year typically.
How do you fly?
Economy, London to Mumbai, typically direct flight. I don't try and take hopovers because emissions are higher. And then it's either a taxi ride or a train from Mumbai to Nasik.
And what have you done in the past few years to reduce, not just your personal, but perhaps even work-related emissions?
Well, I try and combine a number of things when I'm going to a place. So I'm very thoughtful about travel, but I cannot reduce travel because my job is to try and tell stories of climate solutions around the world. And there is huge value in seeing them in person, seeing people in person. But there are no carbon removal solutions that I can afford. And so what I try and do is fly economy, fly the newest plane because I can now look at which planes are available and fly in the newest plane and fly as less as possible.
So do you use a particular tool to figure out which plane is flying?
It's very easy these days. So the Bloomberg system itself, because I book most of my travel through the Bloomberg system, does the calculation for each flight. So it'll tell you this is the flight, this is how much kgs of emissions it's going to be. So I can compare right away in that one tool. I don't have to find an external
fantastic
tool.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. It's something I have personally tried to do as well. in terms of just being conscious about where I'm traveling, when I'm traveling. I have always, I think for the last 4 years, I've combined a work trip with Christmas vacations with the kids. So it's always a workation, and we've ended up in rather unlikely places for Christmas, like Saudi Arabia once, which was kind of fun, wearing Christmas hats there. There's a point you made earlier around an industry being hard to decarbonize a branding problem or as an image problem. The issue airlines currently are facing is a lot around greenwashing. And in your book, you have highlighted Farhana Yamin, who is a climate activist and a lawyer who glued herself, I think it was to the Shell building. And very next day, she was in BBC and a bunch of other media outlets. Airlines face the same thing, where climate activists are getting a lot of publicity from a very high-profile target like aviation. What can airlines do to address these concerns better? They're still flying, they're still emitting. And climate activists, especially in regions like Europe, now North America as well, are real.
Yeah, I think this is a problem with most carbon-intensive industries, where they need to first accept that they are part of a problem, be transparent about the goals that they are setting, be transparent about the steps they are taking, be transparent about the difficulties that they are facing, make sure they're not part of industry groups that are lobbying against climate action, make sure that their giving to industry groups is transparent, and if industry groups do not act as they themselves would act, that they pull out of those industry groups, and that they be real about the solutions that do exist and what it will take to deploy them, and that they work with governments to figure out the policies that would enable those solutions to work. These are all things that corporations have not had to do in the past. These are all new things, and I appreciate that's hard, but the challenge we face is hard. And so if climate capitalism has to become real, then capitalists have to recognize the climate challenge in front of them. And I think a lot of the carbon-intensive industries, and it's not just aviation, this is true of so many other sectors, are choosing to put their head in the sand to blame activists for the activism they're doing, rather than looking inwards to figure out how they can work with the system to reshape the economic system so that they can still provide a crucial service to society in the most profitable way that society accepts is possible. Because we know that you can have decarbonized solutions be profitable. We've seen that in other industries, right? The most valuable auto company in the world is an electric car company. That will start to be true in other sectors of the economy. The most valuable electric utility is going to become the utility that will have the most decarbonized power. That's going to be true eventually of aviation. The company that has decarbonized the fastest, has probably the most electric aviation to offer, will become the most valuable. Capitalism has a way of chasing growth because that's the incentive system that it is created for. But that growth is shaped by what society and governments choose growth needs to be. And I think we've been choosing wrong, and corporations can help work with the system to choose right.
I think that is a fantastic way to close up the discussion. I cannot wait for the day where a Heart Aerospace or a Zero Avia or a Lanza Jet are the most valuable and powerful companies in aviation. Akshat, the final part of this interview is a rapid fire round.
Mm-hmm.
I learned it from Karan Johar, in which you have to answer immediately what comes first to your mind. And I'll start with something simple. What's your favorite book?
The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. It's a series of lectures, actually, more than a book. But, Amitav is such a great speaker that you can read it as a book if you like, or just go to YouTube and listen to his lectures. But he makes the case that we don't think about climate in literature, in fiction, in everyday life because of our lack of ability to imagine climate in literature and fiction. And that's been our great derangement. Fortunately, since the book has come out a decade ago, things are starting to be corrected and you are seeing more fiction in climate. I actually just went to a play that was based on the Kyoto Protocol.
Wow.
That was a fantastic dramatization of international climate negotiations, which I've been part of. And they are boring, but they're so important that somebody made it interesting and elevated the stakes that are in play is a sign that we are finally recognizing the great derangement and correcting.
What play is this?
It's called Kyoto, and it's playing at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon.
Fantastic. I'm going to check it out for sure. Favorite movie? Not The Inconvenient Truth, please.
No, I like sci-fi. The Matrix trilogy is still to me, irritating, but one I can rewatch, and I don't rewatch very many movies.
Okay, Matrix it is. Your favorite airline?
I don't know if I have a favorite airline.
You sort by emissions usually?
Yeah, exactly. For whatever route, the fewest emissions, that's the favorite airline of the day.
Okay, I like that. Favorite airport?
Again, it's not one I think about too much, but I suppose I use Heathrow the most, and so...
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, but I don't have a choice, right? Like, I live here in the UK. I don't know if there's a favorite airport. I mean, I've been to beautiful airports. The Singapore airport's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
The Qatar airport was... The Doha airport was really nice. But, again, that is not what I'm looking for when I'm flying. I'm looking for the least amount of emissions for the destination I can get to.
Love it. What is something you do in your free time?
I pick up hobbies every year almost, and I try and get to a place where I can become a small kind of master of that hobby, and then I move on, because any more mastery will require too much effort, and I don't have that time.
Interesting. What's the latest?
I learned how to solve a Rubik's Cube.
I didn't know whether you could learn it.
Yeah, you can.
Interesting. I just remember Pursuit of Happiness and how you could just solve it in the cab.
You can.
Interesting. Rubik's Cube. What is something you want to learn?
I enjoy music, but I've never been able to play a musical instrument. I've tried. It's sort of like I've picked up the guitar once, I've picked up the piano, but I've never given myself either the effort to try and actually go all the way to learn how to make music, not just repeat music that exists.
Have you considered singing?
No, I can't sing.
You sound pretty good every week when I listen to you on Bloomberg Zero.
I don't know if that lends me to singing. No, I don't. No.
What is the best advice you've received?
A thing that my dad told me, which is that there is good in every person, and maybe you can learn to absorb it.
Okay, fantastic. And finally, if we are meeting 1 year from today and we are popping champagne, what are we celebrating?
That sustainable aviation fuels have scaled up.
All right, I'm working hard at it. Really hard, Akshat. Do you have any questions for me?
No, I mean, how have you enjoyed doing the podcast?
I've loved it. It's so simple. Just be curious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've gone off script dramatically today from the questions we had prepared. And, just curiosity helps, I think, the industry as well. A lot of the listeners are airline CEOs and technology executives who want to scale within aviation. And I think it opens their mind up onto what are the possibilities and how they can scale, like from today's episode.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simplifying, that's simply with an I.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our supervising editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimain is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.